So I'm going to invite my panel up. Steve Daugherty, I met him first when he was working for Samsung, and then he went to AB InBev, and then he went to a couple of companies, ConAgra, most recently Kraft Heinz, and one of the brightest people I know in supply chain. Richard Barnett currently works for Levadata, also one of the smartest people I know in supply chain, and very futuristic. So, you know, when I want to know future trends, I often dial Richard. And Nick is one of the most philosophical, deep thinkers I know in supply chain. So I invited Nick, Richard, and Steve onto this panel. And there are three very different points of view, purposefully. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to say something, and I'm going to ask them to put up an image, right? So if they believe in it, they'll put up the green thumb. If they don't believe in it, they'll put up the purple thumb. But if they're kind of on the fence, they're going to put up the fence sign, okay? Okay, so, and then I'm going to ask them some questions, and then you can ask them some questions, okay? So, gentlemen, let's talk about demand-driven, right? So demand-driven has many different interpretations. And Nick, you've done a lot of work in this area. What does demand-driven mean for you?
Demand-driven is an alternative to the traditional methods that we have used for the last 30 or 40 years in supply chain. And it is basically something we saw yesterday in the sleep number presentation, where we're really focusing on flow of product through the supply chain and removing the noise and disruption of the bullwhip, which we're all familiar with, and responding to actual demand signals, not just the forecasted signals, because we know the forecast is wrong. And I think, as you've recently commented, Laura, in your blog, forecasting is getting harder. It's not getting easier. So demand-driven is the approach that allows you to create benefit in your supply chain by changing the way you plan.
So Richard, what's demand-driven mean for you?
Well, I would say it is flow-based, and it is trying to get to at least as close to the true trigger of consumption. But obviously that gets more complicated depending on where you are in that value chain and how those products or services are consumed. I really see it as an evolutionary approach. I mean, there are niche solution design areas, but there's also this broader, more philosophical, like supply chain design, which is just first principles. And I do think that the Sleep Number presentation was an example of that. You know, applying first principles and then just, it's maybe phased, but you're just working through, you know, in a wave-based approach, how do you simplify, reduce variance and noise, and be more flow-based as a mindset even, you know.
And Steve, how about for you? What does demand-driven mean?
I would certainly agree on the outside-in approach, trying to find the consumer and their viewpoint and their demand. I think when you get into the stochastics of demand, it's much easier to model with the consumer behavior than anybody else's inventory modeling. And so I think if you use that as your source, then you can drive a smoother, leaner supply chain throughout.
Okay, so based upon your definition, is it hot, is it on the fence, or is it down? Let's see your votes. Oh my goodness, all three yeses, okay. And tell me why. Nick, why?
Well, it's in your book on page 137, so there must be something to it. But why is it hot? It's because I believe in it. I had the pleasure of speaking with you last year at this conference, sharing the case study of transforming the Shell supply chain from traditional forecast-driven into demand-driven. And I think having seen that, studied it, tested it, validated it, really tested whether it was real. Are the benefits real? Are they tangible? Are they deliverable? Then I'd say that's what kind of gives me the kind of confidence to say, yes, it's a thumbs up. And I think anybody that is still running traditional forecast-driven supply chains, suffering from excess stock outs, bullwhip, firefighting, really needs to take a look at this and see if it's going to work for their supply chain.
Okay, Richard, tell me your why.
Similar. There's no reason not to at least move in that direction. I mean, like I said, even just from a supply chain design to be more flow-based in your thinking, and then to drill in and look for those opportunities to change where your coupling points are between inventory or buffer stock to a demand signal. Now that might shift across a very complex network over time, but it's not like a binary thing. You can sort of start moving in this direction tomorrow, really. So I think there's no downside in terms of adopting it, that approach.
Steve?
I was thinking about Samsung, and I started collecting point of sale information there in 2003, and I think I met you in 2004, and then you explained to me what I should be doing with it. It was the demand-driven approach, and we used it to both lean out our supply chain, but also drive our S&OP process, drive our marketing response. There's very few downsides that I can see with this approach.
But that was 2004, and you were an early adopter, and not a lot of people have moved on that train. Why?
We talked about this just a moment ago. So I think a lot of people have moved on the train, not had the success or not the quick wins that they expected, and then dropped it.
Okay. And why did they not have the quick wins?
At the end of the day, I think when you're doing any type of change management, you need a solid foundation and fundamentals. So we've talked about the lean and the other types of approaches. If you don't have those fundamentals in place, the new initiative doesn't have a chance to succeed.
So I was talking to a consumer products leader who I respect a lot, and I was talking about demand-driven and why they weren't using point-of-sale data and building outside-in processes. And he's like, well, Laura, we don't move until we have 100% data and the data's perfect, right? And I think we've let perfect stand in the way of progress here. Okay, now let's take our next question. Demand-driven MRP, material requirements. It's not the same as demand-driven. It is a tactic that can come under demand-driven. How do we feel about DDMRP? Up, down, fence. Okay, I love it. Nothing like a little discourse. Richard, now you're very deep in the sourcing area now. Why are you on the fence?
Well, I think that it's a viable tactic or approach, but maybe not for every industry, every company. I think and like I said, it's kind of a double click, and I defer, Nick, to you specifically because you've sort of gone through this journey in detail. But I think, we have to look at a more holistic view, right, which is, where does even the legacy of MRP come from, right? And it's this kind of concept of aggregating and then decomposing demand into netted parts, material requirements, right? So, I would argue that, again, depending on a company's both strategy and supply chain design, specifically demand-driven MRP may not be the implementation sort of solution enablement of what's going to get them there. It may be more in demand sensing, for example. It may be more in adopting flow-based controls and then thinking about performance management, but still having a build-to-forecast model at some deeper, further upstream level because of the nature of their business. So I don't think it is as a universal sort of play, but that's my own personal point of view.
So it may not be the end state, but may be a useful tactic.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Steve, you were down. Why?
I think the last thing MRP needed was 2 more letters.
All right, Nick, you're the most successful when you were at Shell.
Yep.
DDMRP deployment I know of in the world, and that gives you a big thumbs up. Tell the group why.
I think DDMRP itself is just the calculation. It's just the engine in the middle. And I think if you look at certainly a global business with complexity across geographic boundaries, production boundaries, and so on, arguably you do need more than just that type of calculation. And we worked with Orchestrate on a number of different ways of making that calculation to fit the different parts of the business that needed it. So as a single answer, no, it's not enough. But as a calculation itself, it is proven to work. It's proven to be effective when you implement it in the right places and you pick the right strategic decoupling points to make that work.
Yeah, but I think you were smart to pick, I think, the most mature technology that's doing this, right? Conversion of planned orders into that MRP signal.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, are not, that, particular about the technology and testing it and simulating it, and I'd encourage everybody to read Nick's case study.
And you asked the question, why didn't it take off? And I think for at least a decade, if not more, we have been in the era of everything has to be in the ERP. We've used ERP planning modules by and large in many, many large companies. And ERP modules don't support this methodology particularly well at all.
Right.
So I think a lot of failure will have been experienced by trying to force fit a flow-based methodology in essentially a system that can't do it.
Yep, okay. Let's shift gears a little bit. How about 3D printing? Hot, fence, not? Okay, 2 fences and a thumbs up. Richard, let's start with the thumbs up.
Well, I give it a little bit credit. I think the hype around 3D printing is a little bit hype. But as we just saw, right, there's absolutely real applications where it's been, it fits and it's transformative, as applied in a specific application area. So in prototype design, for example, in mass customization, those use cases, in my past life, I worked with apparel companies that were deploying that and having massive success around, and locking in kind of a unique brand experience because of that ability to provide that mass customization experience. But I do agree that like the pie in the sky concept of, while the repair technician is going to the on-site, the missing part is being printed in the back of the truck. I mean, we're just not there yet, and universally that may not make sense. But I do think that additive manufacturing, collapsing prototype, design and building processes around that, it's an enabler of kind of more transformation versus by itself just, solving for a specific business problem. So I think it's something we need to pay attention to. We need to explore. We need to, if we haven't found use cases, we need to, have that included in our supply chain strategy. It's not something to ignore, but by no means is it sort of a panacea or by itself useful in every use case.
It's not a magic wand to fix
No.
all our problems.
Yeah.
Nick?
I pretty much agree with that. We have one in Smartchain. We use it. We use it to make specific items that we use in some of our simulation games and education games. Not as big as the one you just saw there. I think it's a fascinating thing. I'm on the fence because as the presentation this afternoon, as great as it was, it had to acknowledge that it's not for everybody.
Right.
So I'd like to see it work in some places and make a benefit at a total end-to-end level. Be socially sustainable so that you're not shipping products around the world. Make them in location with multi-purpose tools, but it's got to crack some of the problems like single materials and complex stuff and durable things. So long way to go. I'd like to see it work, but I'm on the fence for now.
Okay, so I think samples, I think medical device, I think, things like braces or eyeglasses or shoes, a lot of sense. Steve, you're on the fence. Why?
No, I think you're right that there's definitely going to be applications for this. We saw next door over here the idea of using artificial intelligence to 3D print a better part for a car than could be made with traditional technologies. I think as people drive towards efficiency and sustainability, there'll be more of that. It's not going to replace glass bottles or cans or plastic containers for food. I mean, it's a long way from anything like that.
Okay. All right, let's shift gears. Cognitive computing. Thumbs up, on the fence, thumbs down. Okay. Nick, you're on the fence. Why are you on the fence?
If your question is in the context of 2030, then I think the cognitive element still has quite a long way to go.
And why? What do people like Richard need to do to make it get the go?
Because I think there's a lot of ambiguity in supply chain, in data, in written instruction, in verbal instruction, and I think unpicking that ambiguity is quite challenging. When you think about how some of the, your connected devices, your Alexa and Siri, and you're shouting at the device to try and play a song and it doesn't quite understand what you want it to play and all of that kind of stuff, that's okay because I can go to the device and play it some other way and figure it out. It's not mission critical in the middle of a noisy party that I can't play the song I want. It is mission critical making, multi-million, multi-thousand, $100 transactional decisions if you get the ambiguity wrong. So I'm on the fence because I want it to work and I think it will work, but how much will it be, throughout supply chain implemented? I think, let's see how we go. I think there's more work to do there.
Okay, more work to do. Richard, thumbs up.
Thumbs up. I mean, it's what we do at Levadata to a large degree. We talk about cognitive sourcing. But the first caveat I'll say is this is definitely one of those terms that we always need to be very clear. What do we mean by that use of cognitive? Because IBM and others have really, it's part of the conversation, and there's a history specifically of cognitive computing. In our view, it's kind of really a combination of two elements. One is it's recommendations or prescriptive analytics that's built in the context of augmenting human intelligence. And so the other part of it is that it models or mimics the way brains make decisions because it's capturing how knowledge is codified. That's kind of the two elements. And so when we think about sourcing, for example, you have to think about these critical sort of high impact decisions. We look at, for example, building an ontology of negotiation levers. And so this is codifying what's tribal knowledge or sort of heuristics that people just use their judgment. And then it's saying, okay, what combinations of negotiation levers could be used with this supplier? Here's 9. You normally use 2. But use your judgment, right, on which ones you want to select. But then over time, what we're able to do is then see what combination of negotiation levers are used with what suppliers, how they respond, and then we're constantly improving that. And that's leveraging knowledge not just of that one individual, but crowdsourcing knowledge and expertise across an entire organization. And we're finally seeing this land in real business use cases, be meaningful. It's not just pie in the sky, it's very real. But it is one of these things where you're kind of thinking very carefully around, how do you model how decisions are made? We're not anywhere near, it's narrow AI. It's not broad general AI, right? So let's just to be clear about that.
And Richard, who are the best clients or using it to the greatest advantage? What kind of characteristics?
Yeah, it's interesting. We see kind of a range of companies in different levels of maturity and complexity. So a very nimble, fast-growing company like Fitbit has been a great early adopter. They use it to allow them to scale to compete with, I'll just say it, Apple, which literally has 100 times more resources in the same function that they're trying to do around supply management and sourcing because they throw bodies at the problem. So it's a David and Goliath story. So they're able to look at thousands of different feeds of market intelligence, and they're able to understand and go much deeper with the same suppliers they're trying to compete with, for capacity. So that's a really interesting story. And then it's, for other customers, like a Rockwell Automation or, Lenovo, it's a lot of change management aspects. You're dealing with, global teams. You're dealing with, challenges across, sort of geographies and across the complexity around number of suppliers, et cetera. For those organizations, it's one where they can start building, some wins early on in a specific highly volatile area where there's a lot of focus, and then it begins to scale very quickly and really help these teams which have been asked to do more with less and have been shrunk, but managing more and more billions of dollars of spend, finally get out of react mode and be much more strategic. And when that starts to happen, the change management goes a lot easier. And so, that takes a while. It's not easy, but that's the kind of impact it's having.
Steve, you were up.
Yeah, I know you expected me to be down on that one, but the big challenge now in supply chain and planning with all of the complexity that's coming in is managing additional SKUs and additional customers and additional wants and needs from the commercial side. And the complexity comes not on volume, but on additional SKUs and needs and wants. And so anything that allows the organizations to meet those needs efficiently with the teams that we have is got to be a win. And until today, and talking with Mark, I wouldn't have expected anyone was quite ready, but it sounds like it's getting close to ready.
And I've had a number of people, as I was signing the books, I would say, reflect on the conference, what were your greatest insights? And I had a number of people say, I see more readiness for change. And I see more definitive case studies that open the door for change, which I feel kind of good about. I don't know about you, Nick, because I know we agree that incrementality is not enough, yeah?
Change is difficult, and I think it's difficult to change behaviours. It's difficult to navigate managerial hierarchies to get all the stakeholders aligned. But I think maybe the pressure in business is becoming increasing, as you're just saying, portfolios, complexity, etc. But also the technology is becoming a little more accessible and easier to do. So I think there's probably a convergence of those things, meaning that we probably are on a moment in time where more change will begin to happen.
Okay, descriptive analytics, the ability to take data and to give some visualization. Thumbs up, thumbs down, on the fence. Steve's thinking.
Sorry.
It's not the political election, Steve. Okay, why are you on the fence, Steve?
Well, I wasn't entirely sure what you were going to mean by descriptive analytics.
Okay, that's a good question.
My initial expectation was, okay, doing any analytics well means that you get one answer and 2 or 3 more questions. And I think if you spend a lot of time on the visualization, building additional Tableau dashboards and whatnot, sometimes that slows you down and keeps you from actually getting to the numbers and to the questions that you need answered.
So into the insights.
Yeah.
So people superficially see the data but don't push for the insights. And I think that we've got a lot of discussions going on about connected data and pretty data, but we're not necessarily driving insights. Nick, your thumbs up. Why?
I'm thumbs up because I think understanding how your business is performing is a table stake. I think it's absolutely essential that you look at what has been happening and you use that to some extent to look at how you will be performing. But there is a however to that. And I think as the analytic technology gets smarter and faster and arguably cheaper to employ, we've got to be careful that we don't just create faster fire trucks. The fires in the supply chain, the firefights that we have will still be there, and knowing about them quicker isn't always going to be the answer. We need to do things to fundamentally
Still a root cause discussion.
get rid of them. And I think we've got to be careful when we chase the analytic technologies that we don't just get faster fire trucks.
Okay. And Richard, your thoughts?
I would agree with most of these comments. The only thing I would add also is that, focusing on descriptive analytics, if it's not well defined or the visualization's not there, usually involves also a conversation around metrics, right? And KPIs at what level. If we think about a pyramid of metrics, for example, I think just working through the translation, even if they're just purely descriptive analytics, but looking at harmonization around what's the context of that same information for a functional group in transportation logistics versus all of order fulfillment versus, S&OP, that's just super helpful, and I see a lot of work that still needs to be done in that zone in companies that have gone super deep in data science in one narrow area, but they're still, struggling with the cross-functional alignment of metrics and translation of what they mean.
And that's why I started the conference on the discussion of what is supply chain excellence, because I don't think we spend enough time thinking about what we measure, how that translates into behavior, what we're driving. We've got too many metrics, too many functional metrics. Okay, how about software robots? Wasn't on your list. I threw in a curveball. Software bots.
Bots.
You remember, and it's okay if you don't have an opinion.
Well, is RPA a bot?
RPA is a bot.
Okay. I'm going to do this.
Okay, Nick, why are you on the fence?
I think, and I may be paraphrasing a comment that was made earlier today, that you've got to be careful when you automate things and you codify processes, that your processes work and that you're not codifying old processes and that the processes ultimately limit your agility. So imagine if you had a project and software botting your processes was actually quite hard to do, and you had a project, it ran for 12 months and you got rid of some headcount and you've automated some processes, but then the business changed, or the client changed, or the customer changed, or the product changed, and you were somehow hard-coded into what that bot did. We've spoken to a couple of industries, or a couple of companies in industries, different industries, who have done a little bit of that and found that it became restrictive.
Yes.
So I'm on the fence, because I think it will have value. It clearly will have value as we learn how to do it, but there's a gotcha in there.
There's a lot more to do. And one of the things that I see in our drawings is change, right? And I think right now RPA is promising, but can't really adapt. So Richard, your thoughts? And
Totally agree with that comment.
Yeah.
The only additional observations I would say is, personally, it just bothers me because it's redefining something that we've had in software solutions for literally forever.
Yeah.
I mean, just the concept of having, invoice to PO match, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, hello, like three-way matches just quarter.
like, I remember 1980s. we were
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about
right.
this,
So this is not new. And so on the flip side, I see one advantage is I see that companies are trying to get some momentum around a digital transformation. It's a relatively easy thing to start building a, hey, we got 20 bots done, in the last year. All right, go team. Much deeper question is, okay, what process scope are we going after? What's the value associated with that? Is it adaptable? Does it make sense in context? And those really are the questions. And I think that it promotes a little bit of a short-term micro thinking where that's fine, but if it's not good, if it's missing or compensating for doing the real deeper work, you know what I mean? Whether it's process design or looking at root cause or thinking about supply chain strategy, just to claim success around your digital journey. That I see kind of that behavior in some of the clients that we're working with.
Steve?
So I think the important clarifier here is the supply chain segmentation. So I think in an efficient supply chain where you have standard processes and you're driving for the least touches and standard activity day over day, week after week, I think software automation is a great tool. I think if you're going for a different supply chain segment where you have a highly innovative product or you have a lot of variability or volatility, then for sure it's not the right solution. But I think you'd be remiss for not utilizing it for your efficient supply chains.
So let's wrap up. What one piece of advice would you have for the people in the audience or listening? We've got lots of people listening. Nick?
I think you spoke earlier about challenging the norms and try and be innovative and so on. I think that's really where my thoughts are at, that in the space that I occupy in supply chain, when I was in industry and now in a position to support other industries, I really lean on the position that you have to challenge some of the stuff that we've had for a long, long time that has arguably been broken for a long, long time. And before we put some of the really funky, new, exciting stuff on top, we have to spend some time fixing the foundation, because I think if we don't, we probably won't get all of the benefit out of the funky new stuff. So there's plenty of stuff in the foundational part of supply chain, the transactional part of supply chain, the releasing of orders, the planning, the management of stock. You talked about form and function of stock. Most companies are not there yet still.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to do in those basics, and I truly believe if we resolve those basics, some of that other stuff will work much, much better.
That's one of the things I loved about the sleep number definition. They challenged so many paradigms, right? It was great to see that come to life. Richard, what one piece of advice would you have?
Definitely agree with those comments Nick made. I think, something that's been, I think, very helpful is to look outside in, to really have a model or mentality of, we know that most of the data and information that we need to run a global supply chain is not inside the enterprise. It's outside, right? It's what partners. What we do at Levadata, we see that, managing $3 billion of direct materials spend, we were looking at 1.6 million different sources of data points and insights, and our data science team felt like we were barely scratching the surface. Like, we have access to more data and information that is not represented in an ERP environment. It's not represented in the four walls that can drive massive, transformational outcomes. And I think there's just not enough investment innovation that starts first with an outside-in perspective, because it's so easy to focus just, what you're super close to, your teams, your organization, the pains of yesterday, So that's one thought I think that might help.
Steve?
I agree with all of these points. Two additional thoughts. One, with regards to change management and transformation, I wouldn't discount the need for cross-functional leadership and working with your leads and sales and marketing and finance and legal and all of the other pieces to bring them on the boat.
Okay, thumbs
Yeah.
up
If you don't
says
have
Vic.
them-
Yeah, I think we get all big thumbs up,
Yeah.
right?
You're not going to get anywhere.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then second, I like to quote Teddy Roosevelt for strange reasons. He had one that I like particularly, do what you can with what you have where you are. And I think that would apply for a lot of the conversations this week in terms of get started, do something
Yeah.
Repeat that. Do what you can.
with what you have where you are.
I think that's a wonderful piece of advice. Thank you, gentlemen. Let's
you.
give them a hand.